The population issue concerning Xinjiang has attracted much attention. On January the 7th, Li Xiaoxia, a researcher for the Xinjiang Development Research Center, published an analysis report on population change in Xinjiang, and another report published on January the 6th looked at American interference in Xinjiang affairs under the context of human rights protection. Both reports used facts and figures to refute allegations made about the demographics in the region, such as Uyghur women being submitted to forced sterilization in order to diminish their population. So what does the report disprove about previous accusations surrounding forced birth control? Joining me today for the discussion are Wang Jiang, postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Carle, a former CIA officer, and Professor Shen, director of the International Institute of Cyberspace Governance Research from Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Wang, let me go to you. Help us understand the story. Exactly why these two reports come out now to refute the allegations about Xinjiang population. What are the major findings of, especially the report on the population change in Xinjiang?
Well, it is clearly earlier of last year, there are some of the reports, so-called academic reports, published in foreign country and put allegations as Chinese government to threat the human rights of the Uyghur people. But actually, it's not the truth. So we say the Li Xiaoxia, the Professor Li, I know her in person. She is one of the leading experts in Xinjiang.
What did she find in these reports? Very briefly, yeah.
I would say it's very different from the foreign one. It just says the population growth rate is in the normal range of, if you compare with the whole country. It's nothing suddenly changed.
Well, this is kind of interesting because we are observing again something which looks very familiar. You know, somebody from somewhere, we don't know exactly how, the background. We've heard a little bit from here and there, and then comes up with some kind of report based on some kind of research. If you really look into the research, lots of questions, then answers. And then they accuse China of something, and instead of proving that their accusation has credible foundation, they ask China to prove its innocence. Mr. Carle, how do you look at that? Do you think that, do you agree with me about this kind of pattern, and if this story is one of such pattern?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm afraid on this subject that I disagree with you pretty much entirely. When you look at the multiple sources of assessment and information that have been published on this subject, they come from a range of countries, a range of data points, including satellite photography analysis, reports of people who were on site, and most importantly, leaked documents from the Chinese government. So the facts, I'm afraid, are pretty clearly established in line, roughly, with the report assessment by the scholar that you were talking about.
Professor Shen, your reaction?
About 3 or 5 or more years ago, there's a memo inside the U.S. government named Organized Political Warfare or Organized Political Operations, in which including a special information operation named the Black Information Operation. That's very typical patterns that the host you mentioned. You just providing the stories. You collect all those pieces and mix them together and just then spread out to take advantage of your media in this media world, so that you can set up a demonization fact rather than the truth. You don't care about those truths, but you just to prove your precept ideas. And I have to mention, sometimes even though that you have very advanced technologies represented by CIA, you have a preset ideas, and you just pick up all those pieces of information to prove your ideas, like your invade of Iraq, to finding out the WMD evidence. That's a very clear example. I think those Uyghur things is another example of such kind of information in today's world. A little bit ridiculous.
Carle, your reaction?
Well, it's true. The United States was completely wrong about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And when it was established that we were wrong, we finally said, yes, this was a complete screw up, one of the great screw ups in American history. And how did we do that? How did we establish that? By letting and encouraging that independent journalists and sources of assessment look at the facts on the ground. And that is the opposite, I'm afraid, of what's happening in this context in Xinjiang. So the argument about the process to assess the truth, I would agree with, but the conclusions are the opposite of what my colleague has said.
Yeah, I think it is very important that you mentioned the word independent, and I agree. You know, there have to be independent scrutiny from qualified scholars, from non-political, neutral, and strictly scientific-minded people. And yet, in the case of the accusation on Xinjiang, it seems that the person who has been the main person behind the theory about alleged, you know, even genocide of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang has a very flimsy background, and his funding, you know, let me replay this paragraph from one of the commentators, an American lawyer, when he talked about the background of Adrian Zenz.
But when you dig deeper, you start to understand that these two entities, one is named the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It was started in 1984. The other one is the Group Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders. Both of these groups, as I said, financed by the US government, were the ones that came up with these fantastic stories about 1 million people being detained in Xinjiang in concentration camps. How did they do that? One of them interviewed 8 people, as you correctly identified. The other one interviewed 30 people. All right. These people were carefully chosen by people from the independence groups who want to see an Eastern breakaway Turkestan movement. Both movements that they're sympathizing with have been identified by the UN and by the EU as terrorist organizations. So this is what you have. He created these reports. These reports were then referenced by other entities as credible.
Yeah, exactly. He hasn't finished there. He was talking about how a lot of these evidence are used again and again in a kind of circular argument to create the kind of conclusion, and then this conclusion is used to influence policy and public opinion after being amplified by the media. Carle, your response, please.
Well, I'd say a number of things. The gentleman who's just speaking is clearly a shill for Beijing, and I wouldn't trust too much that he says. There's an old saying that when the finger points at the moon, only a fool will look at the finger, and that's essentially what we're doing here. In fact, there was recently a statement by 39 countries at the UN substantiating and calling for closer attention to the events happening in Xinjiang. The UN Human Rights Commissioner has made the similar statement. As I say, satellite imagery, over 17 independent media outlets, newspapers around the world have come to the same conclusion, and on and on and on. So one can take the easy bogeyman of the CIA and say, well, this is all not true. But in fact, if you look at multiple sources of information, they all are concordant, unfortunately. And it's what does one do when one doesn't like the message? One tries to kill the messenger, and that's essentially happening here. But the only defense that has come from 3 countries at the request of Beijing, and that's Egypt, North Korea, and the third that slips my mind for the moment, and they're hardly reputable defenders.
Well, sometimes you have to question the credibility, right, of the person who makes certain accusations. It's not like whenever somebody makes an accusation, you just have to hurry and look whether this accusation, the accusation, there is this thing called burden of proof. Wang Jiang, what is your reaction so far?
I mean, that is why we should treasure this report from the Professor Li. She spent all her life in Xinjiang and doing studies. She got a lot of opportunity to reach the first-hand material here. So, I mean, well, it is a rational, academic, critical to some of the accusation voice from Xinjiang, and we should treasure that. And another point I want to point out is because I know when we talk about Xinjiang, people say, well, there is a satellite image, and there is some so-called government official documents leaking out. But for many of that, that's just the indirect evidence, or let's say in second-hand material. For example, the BBC reporters, they visit the so-called training center, and lately the Global Times finding out that is only a normal factory. It's nothing to do with a lobber. And I think it is just showing the very difference. The second-hand material can misleading us. That is the precise point I want to make here.
What is the essence of the issue here is the population development of Xinjiang, and I think this report by Professor Li actually laid out some very important figures. For instance, Carle, for instance, according to her research, the population of ethnic minorities increased much faster than the population of Han people, which is the majority of China, in Xinjiang. And then if you look at the population growth of Uyghur people, they are the fastest growing ethnic minority compared to all the other ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang. So, and there are very clear numbers there you can see. So there is a clear difference between the numbers that you see here and what Zenz has speculated based on second-hand information and periphery evidences, so-called evidences, Carle.
Well, Mark Twain, whom I'm sure we all revere, pointed out that there are lies, damned lies, in statistics. And it's very easy to muddy the waters and obscure the view by citing one statistic or another. It all comes down to how accurately one can assess and place in context the statistics cited. And the simple solution to this is to these debates, confusion, or disagreements, is to allow open access to whomever wishes to observe, so that you have independent sources of information. I will say, in fact, however, that the data and the facts are not really in dispute if one wants to go to the source, and the source of the Chinese governments themselves that talk about 147,000 detentions, which is an increase of 50% from 2018 to 19 in camps. That's just one data point. So
I get your point. Yeah, Glenn, Carle, I get your point. I have about 20 seconds left. Let me get the reaction from Professor Shen. Professor Shen, what is your reaction as this kind of logic that if you don't want to, if you don't want people to distrust you, open up and let people go in and investigate? 20 seconds, please.
Let people to come in and investigate. But these people do stupid spy things to help those separatists. How to balance this so-called transparency and national security? We need to take a quite objective attitude to this very complex world. Here is the reality. Those people just don't want to believe you until they got what they want. It's a kind of bad circles. We need more times to break up this very cycle.
We have to leave it there, very complex subjects, but I appreciate the participation of all three of you, Professor Shen Yi, Glenn Carle, and Mr. Wang Jiang.